Hello, I'm Jacob.
I'm Ryan.
And I'm Allie.
We're going to talk about India. Yeah, we're going to talk about like the Vedic people and what they were all about. And we're going to transition into how the Vedas evolved into the early Buddhist period and the rise and fall of empires. And then we're going to talk about a period of relative stability in the Indian front with the Classical Age and the rise of the Gupta Empire. And yeah, so I guess you can start.
Okay, I'm going to start with the Vedic people, who were really just like mainly Indo-Aryans. Different other people were also, I guess, part of that, but majority was like the Indo-Aryans. And they kind of practiced Vedic Hinduism. And a big part of that religion was sacrifices, ritual sacrifices, that they would a lot of times be really big shows. And they believed that they were like responsible for maintaining the order of the world. They had two main types of sacrifices. They had the Griya, which is like the domestic type of sacrifices. These were typically like sort of easy to perform. They didn't require any higher religious people. It's like mainly the average person can do it. I think most often it was when someone were to get married, they like kindle a fire and they just keep it going, and eventually like they could sacrifice objects to it from time to time. But it was really like surface level sacrifice. There was a second type of sacrifice. It was the Shraddha, the higher sacrifices, and those were what I think the average person thinks of when they think of religious sacrifices. They were super like showy, gory. They required like priests and religious higher ups, many different. They were often like big shows, large cattle and ox, and these sacrifices in this second type of higher sacrifice, there were three subtypes that kind of yielded different results. There's one that was like for crops and just yielding good food and harvest. And then there was a second one that was kind of just for like the wealth and well-being of the king and the like civilization. And then there was another one that was just kind of for strength, I guess, for war, battle, stuff like that. And they just, in all of the different types of sacrifices, they sacrificed many different objects, living and unliving, but most common were the big cattle and ox that were really big, like big parts of this like society. Right. So they believed that since they were important to society, it meant more for the gods to receive. And they did these sacrifices because they believed they were responsible for maintaining the order in the world and keeping good karma.
So,
go ahead.
Sorry. You mention sacrifice to the gods, but you don't really mention who the gods are.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah.
Who in particular were they sacrificing to?
Now, I know that if I go back here, then I could probably find a few of the different dudes. I know that there was this one fire god named Agni, or was he the sun god? I know that there was like an earth god. It was a pretty traditional pantheon, yeah. I'd say. Similar to others at the time, like the Greek and the Roman pantheon. And, yeah. Well, that came to
I think most often they had many different gods that they worshipped, and I think most often they would dedicate their rituals to the god that they were hoping to receive from. So it would, I guess, vary by sacrifice. And this was these big sacrifices were towards the early beginning of the Vedic Age, and towards, I guess, the end. They started to transition this along with how civilization transitioned into a different vibe, into Buddhism and such. And so these, as we come closer to the transitional period, the sacrifices themselves also transitioned from bigger, violent, gory, big sacrifices into more smaller self-sacrifices as different beliefs change.
I like your use of self-sacrifice, and that ties in with the transition period that I'm going to be discussing. So the mentality of this time of sacrificing animals and other things to the gods was a concept that was kind of falling out of popularity, and that was due to a variety of different factors. But to me, what I find the most striking comparison is the amount of empires that rose and fell and conquered the territories of the Indian lands, and that was basically 100 years in the second and third centuries BCE of constant warfare, and that can do a lot to your mental. It can change how you worship the gods, and it can spawn movements of absolute nonviolence because, well, yeah, and that's where you get something like Jainism, which is kind of like a precursor to modern Buddhism, and it is the more extreme. They are people that put an extreme faith on karma. That is the principle of,
but no God or founding like
yeah,
figure.
yeah.
They're not
It's
praising
less
a certain
of
person.
yeah, less
More
of
of
praising
belief.
a deity and more of how can I create a world that cherishes life.
Yeah, so it's more of a belief system than a religion.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. I would say the biggest transition is the change from I'm going to worship these gods to I'm going to make the world I want to live in. And a lot of these people at the time were vegetarians. They would fast for days on end. They wouldn't even eat plants at some points because that they were that,
Even
they
the
cherished life
where
that
they didn't
much.
even wear clothing.
Yeah, and
That she meant.
it is at this time where we get a few different what's it called? Belief systems. This is when the belief of samsara and reincarnation really
Right.
explodes. The idea that the actions you take in this life will affect you either in the future or in the next life. And I guess that I should probably talk about, the cycle of rebirth and the caste system. So the cycle of rebirth and the Indian caste system at the time, which had been standing for about 1,000 years, very intertwined. Whatever caste you were born into, whatever you were incarnated as, it was a product of your past life or it was a product of your parents' life. And so I guess the order of hierarchy for early Buddhas there were gods at the top, humans below them, titans below them, ghosts below them, animals below them, and then just hell.
Okay.
And so it would have this, you would live this life as a human, and if you were a good person and you followed the path of the Dharma, which is basically just the path of Buddha, if you would follow that, then you had the potential to be reincarnated as perhaps a man again and live again, or you could even be, a god. You could be incarnated as a god.
What would it take for someone to be put at the bottom of the caste system?
If you have bad choices in your life, then it will affect you in the next life, and you have the chance to be incarnated as an animal.
Okay.
And it was a lot of association with the actions that I take will not only affect me religiously, they will affect me physically in my caste and in my method of life.
Okay.
I think a lot of the moral ground for what actions were good and bad were stemming from, I guess, the belief system at the time. Because following ahimsa, the non-violence principle, that would put you higher up in the karmic points.
Yeah.
Than if you were to go and kill a cow for no reason.
Yeah.
I guess an example of someone that rose above and had a higher incarnation upon their death would be the Buddha himself, Siddhartha Gautama. He was a prince to a king. He lived at 29. he is the modern figure for what the quintessential Buddha should be.
Right.
And he is basically the template, he's the model. Everyone and everything should aspire to be like him. And that's a little bit about early Buddhism. And eventually that gave rise to, with the rise of religion often comes the rise of tyrants and kings, and this one in particularly was the Maurya. The Mauryan Empire was a vast empire that controlled a majority of the Indian land mass. They had the Gangetic Plain and they had the Deccan Plateau at their peak. And a lot of ancient literature and art at this time was preserved, but the fall of this empire kind of gave rise to what he will be talking about, and that's the Classic Age and the rise of the Gupta Empire. And I'll let you talk.
Now, the Classic Age in history basically means timeless, and some of its unique features are things like Vedic Brahmanism, transformation in art, culture, and change in letters, literature, and language. In the 1st century BCE, there was Iranian-speaking Central Asian nomads. Then in the 5th century CE, culture altered to more Turkic-speaking until 1000 CE entered the Muslim Turks, until when the Mongols became more relevant in the 1500s. Mongols, sorry. And then in
the Mongols. Sorry, let me just the Mongols were like 1300s, and I should have said the Mongols. It sounds similar, kind of based off the Golden Horde.
And in later samsara, the Buddha became a god essentially, like he was talking about earlier. In Classic Age of India, from about year 320 through 600 CE was the golden age of India. Their leader Rama laid the model for future leaders essentially, which sort of led towards the growth of current India and different leaders across the country, which now you have modern India.
So why is it called the Classical Age or the Golden Age? What makes it such a bright age?
I think it's kind of like the Industrial Revolution, how we had it in America, but more in India and older time, obviously, it was a little bit different.
A relative time of peace and development with
development was the word I was looking for,
Yeah.
A lot of things were growing in different ways, not as, I don't think barbaric's the right word to use, but their culture stepped away from more of the Vedic age ideology.
Yeah, at this time, a lot of major Buddhist beliefs really came into fruition, involving the Vishnu, the Shiva, Rama, and there's also where we get stories of Hanuman, the Indian monkey god, which is very similar to Sun Wukong, the Chinese monkey god. Sorry, fun fact.
I think one of the biggest differences between like the Vedic age and the Classical age is like not that the people or the Vedas during that time were uncivilized, but I think in comparison to like the civilization and culture during the Classic age, they really do look like uncivilized to some aspect.
Yeah.
What really began the Golden Age too was the fall of the Roman Empire. It was like around the same area of time.
So you had a lot of migration from the west.
And a lot of when they fell in India, they took sort of like around the same time as when they began to expand it in literature, art, like the Romans did.
So that can bring up an interesting idea of the Golden Age and the fact that it presided over the time where the Western Empire traditionally fell.
Mm-hmm.
Do we think that maybe that time of relative peace could have been associated with the fact that so many great empires were rising and falling constantly in this time?
I think it had to do maybe with people weren't getting killed as often, people were living safer lives. I don't know.
I think people were like watching what was happening and they just kind of decided.
Yeah. Also, around this time, over time, people are getting smarter. They're becoming less barbaric.
They're thinking more critically.
Yeah. more of a society aspect versus what's the word? A naturey living aspect. They live in more communities, less of on their own.
And a lot of legendary stories kind of come from this era and were written at this time, like the Gita and the Mahabharata, which are just poems and epics, whether about war or conflict, or maybe they have some relation to religion. But really, the classical age, I like to describe it in my head as in the rest... I want to say in the rest of the world at this time was in a very chaotic stage, but India at this time was a fairly recognizable society, and some of like today's art and today's like when we think of ancient India, this is what we think of.
Yeah, like the creation of the concept of pie. Free society, like guilt-free society, like more modern ideology like we have today.
Yeah, that's just a little bit of development about India as a society and how they, they were challenged, they triumphed, they fell, they rose, and I mean it's a very, very dynamic area of history. A lot of change in a long period of time, and I mean, it's just been interesting to learn. Do you guys have anything else you want to add?
I got everything I had in my head.
All right. Well, that's a little bit about the Vedas, a little bit about the Buddhas, and a little bit about the Hindus.
Classical age.
Classical age. Okay, toodles.
Thank you.